Fluoride in the water supply is a common theme across the United States, as experts believe it supports dental hygiene. But recent studies are saying it can do more harm than good. A local group is joining those in opposition of adding fluoride to the water supply, and 12 News' Brian Melanson spoke with commission members and officials about why they are suggesting this.
In a 5-4 decision, the City of Binghamton Commission for Conservation of the Environment voted in favor to suggest that the city end putting fluoride in the water. According to the National Institute of Dental Research, the addition of fluoride to public water began in Michigan in 1945 as a way to prevent tooth decay and improve overall dental hygiene. According to Conservation Commission member Richard Genesio, they have received new information regarding the harmful effects of fluoride.
In August, we invited Professor Paul Connett, who wrote a book on the topic. He came in from New Hampshire and gave us a slide presentation showing us the research that had been taking place over the years. It was shown that there was a connection between even low fluoride levels and cognitive impairment in children.
Stuart Cooper, the executive director of the Fluoride Action Network, told 12 News that the chemical used in fluoride is dangerous and does not belong in the water supply.
And the chemical used is called fluorosilicic acid, and it is a hazardous waste product that's gathered from the pollution abatement systems, the scrubber systems in the smokestacks of the phosphate fertilizer industry. If it was dumped in a river, it would be illegal. If it was dumped in the ocean, it would be illegal. If it was dumped on the ground, it would be illegal, and it would burn a hole through concrete. But that's what's added to your water supply.
Cooper echoed Genesio's concerns regarding the correlation between fluoride in the water and the danger to children.
According to the CDC, over 70% of our adolescents now have visible side effects of over-ingestion of fluoride during infancy.
The commission said that the next step they would like to see from the city is legislation which officially stops the addition of fluoride into the water. Brian Melanson, 12 News, Broome County.